You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist.
Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige, and as always, I'm so excited you're here. So today I'm speaking with Rahaf Albushi, who is a registered dietitian and owner of Olive Tree Nutrition LLC. She specializes in diabetes prevention and management and intuitive eating. She also has a special interest in the Mediterranean eating pattern. We talk about that a lot in the podcast episode. She also has this role as a media spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, where she engages in frequent media work. So we're really lucky to have her here to talk with us today about, we talk about the power that food has to connect us to ourselves and people around us, to our culture, to the way that we were raised, also maybe to certain regions of the world. We also talk about her background as a Muslim registered dietitian, where we're talking in this podcast episode about some of the unique food practices and beliefs about from the Muslim perspective when it comes to food. So we talk about halal, we also talk about Ramadan, and as always, I like to be as sensitive as possible to any listeners who might be in a place with their relationship with food where maybe it's difficult to talk about fasting, or it's difficult to hear conversations about fasting without getting into sort of a disordered perspective about it. So I just want to provide a content warning here. And just if you're uncomfortable with conversations about fasting, we do it in the context of talking about what Ramadan is, and what the beliefs behind it are, and what the practice looks like, and what even, when do people eat during Ramadan, those types of things. These are the questions we dive into here. But we also want to be really sensitive that there might be some people who just maybe don't want to go there, and that's perfectly fine. So if that's the case, just go ahead and skip this episode. But I'm really, really glad that you're here, and thank you so much for tuning in, as always, and for your support. I also want to give a quick shout out. If you'd like to join the Facebook group for the podcast, we have a Nutrition Matters Podcast community on Facebook where we engage in conversation about some of the podcast episodes, and it's a supportive environment there. And also, if you'd like to donate to the podcast, that's always welcome and appreciated. You can just head to the podcast page on my website, so positive-nutrition.com/podcast. There's a button there to donate if you'd like to donate. And then there's also other ways to give back if donating isn't within your means. Just simply sharing podcast episodes is super helpful. Also, leaving reviews is really helpful in the form of feedback, but then it also helps other people find the show. So if you have any time or means to do any of those things, they are all very much appreciated. And thank you to those of you who have already done that. So with that introduction, I just wanted to again say thank you for being here. And with that, let's get into talking with Rahaf. Hi, Rahaf. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast.
Hi, Paige.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, this is fun. This is your first podcast, right?
It is.
Okay, big moment. Big moment. So talk really briefly about what you do for work and, who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Rahaf Albushi, and I'm a registered dietitian and diabetes educator. and I currently have a private practice called Olive Tree Nutrition, and that's based out of Atlanta. And I really just help people take charge of their health and bring back the joy in eating.
Yeah, that joy piece is something a lot of people are missing, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So talk about kind of what made you interested in studying nutrition and health, and kind of how did you get to where you are?
So, I mean, food had always played a big role growing up. So, I'm originally from the Mediterranean region in Syria. It has really good and tasty food, and my mom would always cook for us cultural food. So, although I was raised in North America, I was definitely exposed to this Middle Eastern cuisine, culture, and heritage.
Talk about
And
Syrian food really quick. Talk about kind of maybe the most famous, noteworthy dishes. I just want to paint the picture. Are they
yeah,
spicy? Are
so
they?
it's Middle Eastern cuisine. So a lot of the famous dishes are, hummus, falafel, tabbouleh, fattoush, kibbeh. Which are the fried balls. So a lot of the, shawarmas, a lot of the typical Mediterranean foods that you see, in a lot of places these days.
Yeah. And so what was one of your favorite things to eat growing up?
I love hummus for sure. Baba ganoush as well. That eggplant dip is really good.
Yeah.
As well with any like side dish or appetizer. Yeah. I mean, it's all
Tabbouleh?
really tasty, really good.
Yes. So much flavor.
Yes,
Never
for sure. It's
boring.
all fresh.
Yeah.
That's the really key part of Mediterranean food is that, it's all, typically homegrown and just everything's so fresh and, made at home.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so I interrupted you. You were raised in North America, but your mom made a lot of traditional dishes from the Mediterranean region growing up.
Right, exactly. So I had that exposure and, food was really enjoyed. And I would say, I had a really positive experience with food growing up. From an early age, I would all get involved in the kitchen and, would help out and cook these meals. And it was really important for my mom that she taught me how to cook these, cultural dishes. And, we'd always have people over. And of course, food was involved. So I think that was really key me growing up.
Do you cook those things to this day, like stuff your mom would make and connect you
Absolutely.
to,
Yeah.
where you were born and how your mom, was your dad from the same area?
Yep. So we're both have parents from Syria, and I still, I have a little recipe book that I have handmade notes in it, just recipes that are just passed down, and you can always, every few weeks I just have to call, and ask about a recipe.
Yeah.
Just like, how do you do this again? What was the way? And there's a lot of variations of how to make these foods. So, Middle Eastern food covers, the whole range. So there are certain foods that are, specific ways that Syrians make versus, Lebanese
Right.
regions. So, they're all similar and there's a lot of overlap, but there are certain foods or the techniques can be a little slightly different. So I always make sure, I want to do it the way that, my grandmother used to do it and great grandmother. So just to kind of pass that on.
And don't you think food is so powerful in connecting us to that type of thing, like connecting us to our ancestors, the way they ate, and to a certain like region in the world and the way they eat right now. And I think it's so cool to consider just the power that food has to take us to different places and to connect us and to, give us more than just fuel.
Exactly. Yeah, it definitely plays a huge part in culture and really like helps define too, like who you are. It's like, one of the first conversations that people have, it's like, well, what do you like to eat? What kind
Yeah,
of foods?
that's true.
So
What's your favorite food? Yeah, so how
great.
do you answer that when someone asks you?
Yeah, so I just say, a lot of, just like what we talked about right now, some of
Yeah.
those really famous foods. And it's really nice to have people these days that are familiar with these foods because, a lot of, there's a lot of diversity now in North America, which is awesome. So people, it's like when you mention like falafel and shawarma, they're like, oh, okay, I've had that. And even though it may not be exactly the same as, it would be made in Syria, but at least, they understand the variation of
The
it,
concept. Yeah,
the
for
concept. So
sure.
it's refreshing to do that. And of course, there's, more than just the typical foods that it would be great to introduce other, people to. And I do
I'd
try
love to go
to
out to
put,
eat with you. I want you to show me all the things.
yeah, you should definitely come over. I'd love to like host people, and I try to make sure that I include some of those foods on my blog, and I'm continuing to add on to those just to increase exposure
So
to these.
your grandma and your mom don't care if you share the family recipes?
Yeah, no, of course
Oh,
not.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's so great. I love that. So tell me a little bit about what you do with diabetes.
Yeah, so right now I work mostly with people with diabetes, mostly women who are interested in diabetes prevention and wellness, or those that already have diabetes or gestational diabetes. And really women who are looking to embrace that lifestyle change without dieting and food restriction. And I think it's really especially important with people with diabetes. There's a lot of food fear usually involved, especially around carbohydrates and certain foods that have sugar. So I feel like it's really important that we eliminate some of that food fear and really work with people and bring back that joy aspect into eating.
Yeah, joy is so important. It connects us to better ways of caring for ourselves than restriction, for sure. Like when you're enjoying a food, there's a certain point where you're like, I'm not enjoying this quite as much. I think I'm about to be done, or maybe I am done with eating this at this point. People think joy is like scary or enjoying food is scary, but really it connects us to how to care for ourselves well, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, so tell me so we're going to spend a lot of time today kind of talking about the idea of your personal cultural and religious heritage and how that plays a role in your approach to food, in your experience with food, and maybe even how you counsel clients and patients. So does that sound like a pretty good outline of where we'll head?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, awesome. So let's dive in. Let's talk about a word that a lot of people have probably heard, but maybe aren't quite sure what it means. So let's define this term halal.
Okay. So I'd actually, if you don't mind, just kind of take a step back and
Please do, yeah.
just kind of define that, so just for our listeners to know, so I'm a dietitian who is Muslim, and means that I practice the religion Islam. So I think there could be some confusion around those two terms. And just as a background, there's like 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and around 5 million Muslims or even more in the USA. So there's a lot of diversity within the Muslim population as well, living all over the world. So there may be some misconception that Muslims only live in one part of the region in the world, but we're actually all over. Anywhere between the Asia Pacific, which has the greatest population. Then there's, of course, the Middle East, North Africa, throughout Europe. And
Southeast Asia, even. That I studied abroad there, and certain regions there.
Yes,
yeah.
For sure. So we're, so it's a global.
It's everywhere, yeah.
Not everywhere. So just kind of put that in perspective. And yes, so the term halal, a lot of people may hear it, especially around like grocery shopping, usually comes up. So halal is an Arabic term that means lawful or permissible. That's, the exact definition. And the opposite of halal is the word haram, which some of our listeners may have heard of, and that just means unlawful or prohibited. And I mean, these terms apply to everything in life. So from food to like relationships, financial transactions, clothing, etc. So it really covers all aspects of life.
Okay, so it's not just a food term then?
No, it's not.
Oh, that might be a misconception, because I totally thought it was just about food.
Yes, usually it's associated with food, mostly just like I said, like in grocery shopping or going out in restaurants, but it definitely covers, it's all aspects, the way of life that, as a Muslim, we should live in a halal way, or
Gotcha.
in a way that's
in
lawful
general.
or permissible, in
Yeah.
Islam.
Okay. So will you kind of help us understand the implications for food?
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to food, all foods are halal or lawful, except pork and its byproducts and alcohol. So everything else is halal except those two things, pork and alcohol. And then so you have foods that contain certain ingredients like gelatin, enzymes, emulsifiers, and flavors. Those foods may be questionable because we don't know the origin of these ingredients. So, for example, you have yogurt that has gelatin, and sometimes we don't know the source of the gelatin. It could be pork or something else. So those foods can be questionable, and unless there's a symbol on it, like kosher, for example, or an Islamic, some of these yogurts have like an Islam signal on it, then it
I
would
see.
be questionable to consume that product.
So if a food has something that says halal on it, then you know that the gelatin, for example, that's in that food is derived from something other than pork.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Halal
Gotcha.
or kosher would be the same thing.
Okay. So, but isn't there like distinctions between kosher and halal, or no?
Yes, there are some differences, but with kosher, people
If it's
who
kosher, then it's
are for
halal.
kosher, they don't eat pork.
Yeah. So if
So it
it's
would be the
kosher,
same.
then it's automatically, right?
Exactly.
But if
Kosher
it's
automatically
halal,
halal.
it might not be kosher.
No,
Right. Right.
exactly.
Right. Okay. That makes
Got it.
sense. Cool. So yeah, tell
Yeah,
me.
and I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
the term halal meat, basically, like we talked about, like which foods are halal and which are not, and then usually the word halal is people hear it in association with meat. So halal meat, refers to the method that the animal was slaughtered, which needs to be done in the least painful and quickest way, and that's through cutting the jugular vein. And there's the other component of making the meat halal is that the name of God, which is Allah, must be mentioned, and that just signifies divine permission to slaughter the animal. So that's what makes a meat halal.
Okay. And so can you just go to a grocery store and buy any meat, or do you have to go to a special place?
So you typically have to go to a special like butcher shop or place that would sell halal meat. Preferably, so as Muslims, we should try to consume halal meat as much as possible and halal foods. But sometimes, obviously, that can present a challenge, especially in non-Muslim majority country.
Right.
So, as a side note, it is permissible to eat meat that is kosher. So that gives us some more flexibility. So if the meat is kosher, or the people of the book, basically, then it is permissible to consume that meat. But of course, if available, then halal would be a better option.
So culturally, is there any ability to kind of be flexible with rules, or are they pretty rigid?
So
Or is
in
that
terms of
practice
the
different?
halal meat,
Well, is there like degrees of orthodoxy, or is everyone expected to be very rigid about like you must know what every ingredient is, or are there some Muslims who just kind of say, I'll do the best I can, but I'm not going to let this stress me out, or yeah, I guess I'm just
right?
curious
Yeah.
about that.
So you'll definitely find a range
Okay.
for sure, and I think that's in every religion.
Right.
So you have Muslims that are like super strict that they absolutely won't consume anything unless they're 100% sure that it's halal certified. And there are some organizations that do that for certain products, and then you have Muslims that for those foods that are questionable. So if we don't know the source of gelatin in yogurt, and say there's no kosher symbol, so then some are more relaxed around that, and basically assume that it's not pork, even though since we don't know exactly, since it doesn't say it is pork for sure. So then it could be any source, and for that reason, you'll find some Muslims that are more relaxed in that aspect,
Yeah.
and it's important to embrace a full halal lifestyle. I think that's what's more important than be really nitpicky on certain foods, making sure that they are halal, being nitpicky on certain foods, ensuring that they are halal versus just embracing a full halal lifestyle.
Right. Kind of like the spirit of what you're doing is more important than maybe the nitpicky being exact rule following. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And the reason I asked that question, I just think it's interesting to point out the fact that, different people practice things differently. And we tend to think about religion specifically as like this monolithic thing where it's like, if you're a part of it, then everybody thinks the exact same way. Everybody acts the exact same way. And yeah, there might be guidelines and there might be rules and there might be expectations, but within any group of people, you're going to find diversity. You're going to find different ways of viewing it, different ways of how people are brought up, different, parts of the world. I'm sure it's different to grow up in the United States versus growing up in Syria, how you approach things, just because you're not around every single, every person you're around isn't necessarily practicing the same religion, right?
Exactly.
So it presents some difficulties. And so, yeah, I think the world would be a better place if we remembered that just because someone practices a certain religion or is from a certain part of the world doesn't mean that they necessarily are all the exact same person,
Exactly. And, and although you mentioned, it does present some difficulties and challenges, but also I like to look at it that it presents some opportunities as well, right? So opportunities to increase awareness around these terms and provide products and create products that are halal and that, that serve a lot of the Muslim population. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about just broadly beyond halal with food specifically, but beyond halal, talk about how your cultural perspective and background and also religious beliefs influence your particular food choices, eating habits, your approach to food, your philosophy around food. Yeah, just interested to hear about that.
Yeah. So we briefly discussed earlier around the influence of adhering to a halal diet. And of course, that affects my food choices. So I stay away from all pork and its byproducts. So even things like lard, ham, stay away from those and alcohol. But, what other than that, what influences my food choices is, being a Muslim, we are encouraged to choose nourishing foods. And being mindful of our eating. And that's evident in, the traditions in the prophets. So we're encouraged to not eat a lot of meat. We're encouraged to eat a lot of whole grains like barley and vegetables and fruit. And there's a lot of foods as well that are mentioned in the holy book, the Quran, that there's a lot of significance to. And so I try to make sure to include those in the diet as well. So things like olives and figs, pomegranates and honey and dates. So those are all foods that, have a lot of, prophetic traditions in them, and we're encouraged to consume those as much as possible. So other than that, of course, culturally coming from the Mediterranean region, like, I'm used to eating a lot of the fresh fruits and vegetables, beans, lentils, and grains, and that definitely affects what I cook and the foods that I choose and feed to the family, of course.
So that's the thing I find really interesting that you just said is the idea of mindfulness. When we think of mindfulness, we often immediately think of like Buddhism. So talk about how mindfulness plays a role in your cultural background.
Yeah, so there's actually a great emphasis on mindfulness in Islam. And so in Islam, we're encouraged to be mindful of our actions and behaviors, and really so that we become the best human beings possible.
So talk a little bit about, so we're recording this before we're going to be releasing it, obviously, quite a bit in advance, but we just finished Ramadan, and talk about that, what that is, And I'm going to ask some specific questions, but just talk broadly about it first.
Yeah, so Ramadan is a holy month where Muslims fast from dawn to sunset every day, abstaining from all food, water, and drink, and sexual interactions. And it's basically a month of increased spirituality, worship, and community. So, just to clarify, I know because I get asked that a lot. So, we break our fast every day. So, you're just fasting from dawn to sunset. And then at sunset, you break your fast, and then you can eat, anything, of course, that's lawful between the hours between sunset and then the next dawn. So, it's not a full month of fasting, but you do that every day for 1 month. And the month of Ramadan, if we follow an Islamic lunar calendar, so as a result of that, every year it shifts 11 days. Every year is 11 days earlier. And this year, started in mid-May and it ended in mid-June. So we just finished a couple weeks ago.
So I have lots of questions about this. So I live in Utah. There's a lot of people from the LDS or Mormon background. And in that tradition, they fast for 24 hours. So breakfast and lunch usually. So they usually eat dinner the night before, and then breakfast and lunch they skip, and then they eat dinner. But they abstain from all food and drink too. So fun fact, if you didn't know that about Mormons, and that's once a month. So talk about like, is there flexibility there for someone who has a medical condition or someone who has an eating disorder or, it's always kind of tricky. So this podcast has a lot of listeners who sort of come from maybe that perspective, maybe struggling with an eating disorder, and talking about fasting can be a little bit triggering. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like, so how can we talk about this in a responsible way that's just explaining what it's like to fast and explaining reasons behind it, but also being sensitive to the fact that maybe some people medically that's definitely not advised.
For sure. So definitely there are some people who are exempt from fasting. And of course, that includes all children, the elderly and frail. And if you have, of course, a health condition, whether, depending on each person, but, in general, if your health condition medically can't allow you to fast, so whether that be an eating disorder, if you have diabetes, or even if you're pregnant or a breastfeeding woman. So it is a case-by-case scenario, and every person knows themselves best. But the point of fasting is not to create hardship. That's not the point of it, of course. So it isn't, but if you can fast, then of course there are a lot of benefits to fasting. Physically and of course spiritually and mentally. So just kind of to make that clear. Of course, there are, you'll find that in the community there's a strong sense of pride in fasting in community during Ramadan. So you'll find that a lot of elderly will choose to fast, even though they may not be in the best situation to fast, and that's where you really need to identify those, elderly people and work with them to see how they can fast in a safe way. Because again, like the purpose isn't to create hardship or make you sick, right? So does that clarify a little bit about?
So it's sun up to sundown, right?
Yeah. So dawn. So a little bit before sunrise, so okay. Dawn to sunset.
So do you eat something right before dawn usually?
Yeah, so there are two major meals eaten during Ramadan. So there's the pre-dawn meal, and that's called suhoor. And that you can think of it as your breakfast. So depending though on one's location, that could be as early as 3:30 a.m. In the summer,
what if you live in Alaska? What if you live in Alaska? You have to fast a lot longer than someone who lives on the equator, right?
That is very true. So it just depends. It all depends on where you're living. So like some people, like in North America and regions, it could be anywhere from 3:30 in the morning to here in Atlanta it was around 5 a.m. So you wake up. It is strongly encouraged that you wake up and eat, to have a meal. It could be whatever you wish, just a breakfast meal. So a lot of whole grains and fruits and vegetables are encouraged. Suhoor is that pre-dawn meal at 3:30 a.m. And then you have the second meal, which is the sunset meal, and that's called iftar, and that could be as late as 9 p.m. So you can see that in the summertime, the days are really long, and you could be fasting anywhere between 12 to 16 hours a day. And of course, as Ramadan's just close to the spring and eventually into the winter, the days will be much shorter.
So what is that like to go that long without eating?
So, the first couple of days are definitely tough. And that's why it's really encouraged, fasting is encouraged throughout the year, not just for Ramadan. And I mean, Ramadan is definitely a pillar in Islam, but if you're used to fasting, a couple days a month, which is recommended, then it makes it easier. But for sure, if you're, the first couple of days, your body will adjust. But, our bodies are amazing and will adjust to any condition that's under. So if you're, making sure that you're properly nourished and, fasting safely and, getting the rest that you need and incorporating that self-care and, those components, then, it is, really refreshing, actually. You can really feel that your body's going through this detox.
So what about exercise implications, and specifically, like, how do athletes who are fasting for Ramadan, how do they do that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of athletes that do that. So, there's this misconception that if you're fasting, that you can't exercise no matter what. And I, discourage that, because it doesn't mean that because you're fasting that you can't do anything and you just have to sit on your couch and not move, right? So, we're fasting, and people, we have day jobs, and, you go about doing what you need to do. And with fasting, if you're doing like light activity, like walking, or even like stretching and yoga, things that are not very intense, then definitely you can exercise. I mean, in the summertime, it can be more of a challenge. So it is encouraged to exercise like right before that sunset meal, so that, within an hour or two, you're going to be breaking your fast. So that's when I encourage people to do their exercise. But you can, or yeah, of course, you can do it after sunset and anytime during the night. You can incorporate that, or just early on before that suhoor meal, that pre-dawn meal. You can incorporate some exercise. And, with athletes, there's a lot of athletes that can choose to fast and, just have that stamina and mental capacity to continue on with their fast. And, it may affect their performance and whatnot slightly, but, that's a decision that every athlete chooses to take.
So it seems like a powerful way to build community, because food just in and of itself is a powerful way, but also when everyone is doing this together and then coming together for their meals, it seems like a powerful way to kind of connect.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what it is. There's a huge community feel during Ramadan, and you'll find that there's a lot of people that come together at mosques, which is that, place where we worship, and that actually come together and break the fast. And you find a lot of mosques offering, free dinner meals, so that free suhoor, to create that community feel. And people come together and break their fast together, and then afterwards pray together. So, one other aspect of Ramadan is, other than the fast, there's these nightly prayers called Taraweeh that Muslims are encouraged to participate in. So, people come to the mosque, they break their fast together, enjoy that social aspect, create those bonds and friendships, and then people, pray together. So it's a really great way to uplift the community and get people together. There's a huge sense of like family that happens. So, even though you may not have family, direct family within the same city that you're living in, but if you're, you have that community family that happens. And that's really evident, especially during Ramadan.
I bet. I bet. So, so if someone can't participate in Ramadan due to some medical condition or anything else, are they kind of on the outs, or are they looked down on, or are they welcomed into the fold? How does that work for someone who might not fit that mold?
Yeah, for sure. So there's, of course, a lot of people that may not be able to fast physically and, just medically they're unable to. And that doesn't mean that they can't participate in Ramadan or get the same spiritual feeling. So, of course, they're welcome to, come to the mosque and engage in that social aspect and, of course, pray together. So even though you can't, physically fast, doesn't mean that you don't get the that spirituality from fasting, from the Ramadan, just by not fasting. Of course, it all comes down, to your intention. With fasting, there has to be an intention, why you're doing it. And of course, that's, like I said, it's a pillar of Islam, and we're doing it, because it's prescribed upon us to do so. And you do get that reward because with fasting your sins are forgiven as you fast, and if you do it, of course, intentionally for the sole purpose of getting closer to God and being God conscious and being a better human being, worshiping God some more, there's a lot of usually intent, more worship during this month than perhaps other months, so you do get that reward of Ramadan, even if you are not fasting because you're unable to.
Yeah, intentions are huge, and that's a really big deal in terms of whether or not you participate, and also like your intention behind it participating. Is it? I know that something I run across in the culture. The dominant culture that I live in is sometimes the intention behind fasting here is more like, oh, well, that's a socially acceptable way to restrict, or that's a way to like not eat very much, or that's a way that I can lose weight and no one can talk about it, or that's a way that I can have an eating disorder and not have people worried about it because I'll just say that I'm fasting, right? So there's some things there's some elements and layers of intentions for why you do this that I think are important to explore for yourself and to make sure that I'm highlighting you and your background and your experiences because I think it's important just culturally for us to have more awareness and competence about how people in our communities worship, how they eat, why they make decisions about food the way they do. But I'm always nervous about, glorifying fasting, especially for any listeners who have that kind of disordered eating background. Mm-hmm. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And we need to be sensitive around that topic for sure. And that's not to say there are not people in our community that, don't have eating disorders. I'm sure there are people that have eating disorders or patterns of disordered eating. And I think that's something that we need to talk about and make sure that, we are fasting for the right reasons, like you mentioned. So it's an important topic that may not be addressed, and maybe we should be addressing it some more.
Yeah, like opening up that dialogue. Like when you go around and give talks about healthy eating during Ramadan, I think it would be interesting to open up a dialogue about like why are we fasting, and is there any element of disordered eating here, and how do we make sure that this is about what we want it to be about and not all these other societal expectations or body image things or whatever. It's an interesting angle that I see in my practice that I was curious to know about, your community and your experiences. In certain communities, maybe things aren't talked about very much, but it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think it's important. And when I do these community talks, we definitely talk about the purpose of why we are fasting. And I do remind them, I really stress the importance of mindfulness and mindful eating and to slow down when you are eating. making sure that you're including a variety of foods. Fasting is meant to be for us. It's supposed to help us. It's not, God doesn't need our fast. We're basically going 24 hours on one meal, and that can also that's not good, and it's not what's encouraged at all. So it is part of the prophetic tradition that we do wake up and that we do properly nourish ourselves and have drink water and eat dates and foods that are nourishing. So
going all day without water seems so hard.
Right. I mean, but again, your body's so magnificent and is, I'm not going to say it's not challenging, especially during the summer months, but you really learn to appreciate water afterwards. That first sip of water after a long day's fast is the best tasting water ever.
Do you have to kind of sip it instead of chugging it, I would assume?
So I mean, you should definitely take your time drinking it. You shouldn't gulp the whole glass in one shot. So actually there's, it is recommended that you actually be sitting down when you do drink it and, drink it at least over 2 or 3 chunks. So that you are, again, it is, after a long day's fast again, and it helps with the digestion process. So I review the importance of mindfulness and slowing down when you are breaking your fast so that you don't get, upset stomachs and improper digestion. So really, those topics are really important and they need to be addressed.
Do people struggle with digestion during this time? Is that like a pretty common thing, like getting constipated or having diarrhea or feeling nauseous or anything like that that's common?
It could happen for sure. One of the most common ones that I hear just from talking to clients, in the members communities, of course, constipation is a challenge. Of course, when you're not drinking enough water, and if you don't eat the right foods, fiber-rich foods, whole grains and fruits and vegetables, and that could definitely impact it. And that's where, the importance of education comes in. There are challenges, like dehydration, and a lack of sleep is also a huge challenge because, again, especially, during the summertime where the days are long, the nights are really short, and by the time you break your fast and then you do your nightly prayers, the Tarawih prayers, there's only a matter of 3 to 4 hours before you have to wake up again and have that pre-dawn meal. And of course, if you're doing, if you have a full-time job, it can definitely affect, the number of hours that you do get to sleep. And that's where, making sure that you do get a nap somewhere in midday so that it re-energizes you. And just, those gentle reminders for people is really important.
So is there anything else you wish people knew about the Muslim world and food and eating and nutrition?
I mean, there's a lot to know. I think, I had the opportunity of seeing a lot of people with diabetes. I had the opportunity to really work with people with diabetes who chose to fast, who do choose to fast. And just to clarify, I mean, some people, just because you have diabetes doesn't mean that you can't fast at all. But there's some situations where fasting can be more challenging. And I think it's important as a dietitian and for our dietitian listeners just to be aware of how to, counsel someone with diabetes who chooses to fast. So you can either, refer them out to someone who is more aware of that, or just, because there are some challenges around like hyperglycemia, so high blood sugars. That can happen, or low blood sugars. If you're fasting the whole day, of course, you're at increased risk of low blood sugars and dehydration. So making sure that they are receiving that proper diabetes education before Ramadan starts, and working with the family physician or endocrinologist to have medications adjusted before fasting. So some medications, need to be reduced or changed. So I think that's really important. And, I strive to hold those community workshops to increase that awareness. I mean, even simple things like checking blood sugars. So there's that misconception that checking blood sugars can break your fast, and that's not true. So I would encourage, people who are fasting with diabetes to make sure that they are checking those blood sugars throughout the day, just to monitor how they're doing and knowing like when to break your fast, when's the cutoff point, and what to do.
So if someone recognized that they needed to break their fast before it was actually time, that would be permitted?
Yeah, for sure. So safety first. I mean, that's the most important thing. So the point of, again, fasting is not so that you're creating hardship or that make you sick. So safety is number one. And if you're medically, of course, unable to fast, then of course you're supposed to break your fast and take care of yourself. That's more important. So definitely value that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like, intentions matter as to why you're doing, but also intentions matter as to why you might need to be flexible with the rules, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
That's okay. Well, thank you for sharing all of this. I hope that this was as interesting to listeners as it was for me. I think it's just important for us to understand each other and to have awareness about how and why people do what they do with food. I think it's a fascinating thing on many levels. So thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to just take a minute to talk about how people can find you?
Yeah. So, like I said, my private practice is called Olive Tree Nutrition. So they can just visit me at olivetreenutrition.com, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and I do maintain a blog that's like Mediterranean inspired, with Mediterranean recipes and diabetes related information. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Paige, for inviting me. I think it's super important to have this open dialogue and increase awareness of all religions and cultures. And especially since we are seeing an increase in cultures and diversity in clinical and practice settings. So, dietitians really need to be equipped with understanding those cultural behaviors and eating patterns. And, in general, it's people and our listeners, so that they understand what, certain terms may mean, or what certain practices, certain religions are doing. And to be open and reaching out if they would like more information, and just really increasing that awareness is super important.
Totally agree. And thank you so much for joining me. This was a blast.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.